From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters.
My fellow Americans, my first and highest duty as president is to defend our great country and the American people. I swore an oath to uphold the laws of our nation, and that is exactly what I will do.
It has been a week of protests and rage in the United States as civil unrest takes over major cities over the case of George Floyd, a black man whose killing by police officers was captured on video. While this started in Minnesota, it has fueled protests across the U.S., and President Donald Trump's response has also been carefully watched. It's no surprise that he's a law and order president.
These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror.
But it did seem surprising when he had authorities open up on a peaceful protest at Lafayette Square for a photo op at a church across the street from the White House. Today, we woke to mostly peaceful protests across America, but there's no end in sight. If you combine this with the US president's universally criticized handling of the pandemic, this looks like we finally hit the Trumpocalypse that may signal the end of this presidency. Or is this the moment that his strongman authoritarian moves hulkifies his base and makes him stronger than ever? To discuss the US protests and Donald Trump's response, as well as what he's seen on the streets of DC, we are joined by Edward Keenan, Washington Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Ed, thanks so much for being with us.
I'm happy to be with you. It's good to hear familiar voices from home right now.
So Ed, let's start with, can you tell us what it's been like in DC during these protests? And obviously we want to know, are you obeying the curfew?
Well, I'm exempt from the curfew because I'm credentialed media. So I was out last night, Tuesday night, until about midnight, covering the protests and observing things. And interestingly, I was on my way home from protests in Washington and could see quite a lot of Washingtonians not obeying the curfew, not just because there were protesters in the streets, but also people were walking their dogs, riding bicycles around the neighborhood, jogging. Throughout, I guess, the civil unrest, the spot looting, the protests of the last week here in Washington, but also that seemed to have kind of overwhelmed America, or at least America's news. There's also a weird life goes on kind of thing where, if you go out in the middle of the afternoon, people are still sunbathing in parks and going to work and walking their dogs. Life goes on as usual, but all the stores are boarded up and there are significant and large protests. And at the scenes of those protests, it's something entirely different. I've been out a couple days in a row to cover them and talk to people at them. Especially at night, they're often tense in this sort of confrontation between the police and the military, the National Guard, that are out here not just enforcing curfews, but, standing in a line protecting the White House and standing in multiple lines protecting some of the monuments on the National Mall. Especially on the weekend, there was a sense where it felt like at those protests, especially at night after dark, that things could spill out into sort of all-out violence. And they never quite got there, as they have in other cities around the United States, where we've seen, I'm sure that you've seen in Toronto, if you're watching, in New York, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, in many cities around the world. You've seen some pretty shocking scenes of police and protesters battling, and most of them that I have seen, and I've been, trying to make it a habit of taking in as much as I can, often police sort of rushing into crowds of protesters and either, swinging clubs, spraying tear gas, trampling people. And then, of course, you have those among the demonstrators who have, in cities around the world and here in Washington, at times been sort of breaking windows, setting buildings on fire, looting, running into stores. There is, up in northwest Washington, D.C., well away from probably about 10 kilometers away from the White House, a beloved kind of local in a neighborhood called Friendship Heights, which is right on the Maryland state line, a beloved family-owned drugstore slash grocery store had the windows broken and I think some liquor stolen out of it. So all of that is happening at the same time. I would say that at the protests and at times when things have been happening, it's a very almost oppressively tense atmosphere, but that a few blocks away from that, people are still sitting on patios, but they're talking about it, right? It's the topic of conversation. People in Toronto might remember when the G20 was there and there was mass demonstrations in the streets and, of course, an aggressive police response to that it kind of captured the city's attention for the duration of it, even if people in other parts of the city who weren't attending the protests and whatnot were maybe still having dinner parties. It became a topic of conversation that was right there in the front of your mind, even if it wasn't right there in front of your house. And I think something similar is happening in D.C. right now and all across the country.
It's fascinating to think that we are seeing these scenes in the U.S. as we come upon the 10-year anniversary of the G20 riots in Toronto. I also find it interesting that this administration has chosen to use police brutality in response to protests about police brutality, which could be seen as a little bit ironic. But seriously, do you see an end in sight to this civil unrest?
It's hard to see where the end is. And it also, this week is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And it's kind of telling that at some points in the past, Donald Trump has expressed admiration for how the Chinese got a handle on Tiananmen Square, that they had a problem there with demonstrators and they had a tough response that kind of made the problem go away. And certainly you have to be careful sometimes when talking about President Trump and the things that he does because people will accuse you of exaggerating or whatnot. But the fact that he found that response to Tiananmen Square to be a model to follow and said that publicly, not this week, but in recent years, maybe leads to an understanding of how he approaches this kind of thing in general. He spent Monday and Sunday and much of Monday kind of quiet, right? He didn't make any public appearances. And of course, we were seeing these people around the world were seeing, and some of us were seeing in person, these scenes of mass protests, confrontations with police and National Guard, on the Lafayette Square, which is directly across the street from the White House. And then, of course, nighttime scenes in Georgetown and other neighborhoods in downtown Washington of fires being set, windows being smashed, stores being looted. And these reports that were coming out that at one point he had been taken by Secret Service to a secure bunker in the White House. So there's this kind of public impression of him cowering away while the city around him is kind of melting down, which was perhaps exaggerated. But the reports, and I haven't spoken to inside sources at the White House who told me this directly, but I think the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post have sort of all had reports where people were saying that he was a little bit stung by that impression that he was hiding away. And so then he came out with his tough response, which was to make a speech comparing demonstrators to terrorists while saying that he was an ally of peaceful protesters. Also then in the same thought, saying that the property damage and whatnot that was taking place were acts of domestic terrorism, that he was going to meet them with a military response, and that in fact state governors across the country who were unwilling to crack down and put an end to this immediately, he would send in active duty military into those states. He's kind of invoking the Insurrection Act there and threatening to take over cities against the wishes of their governors in cases where they wouldn't do what he wanted. And just as he was speaking those words, immediately before and as he was unannounced, of course, most of people listening out there will already know, a protest that was at that point entirely peaceful outside Lafayette Square was forcefully cleared. There's some debate about whether technically tear gas was used, but pepper balls, which are pepper spray that you can essentially fire out of a gun or throw, were deployed, which the Centers for Disease Control classifies as a form of tear gas. So they were deployed, as well as smoke canisters. Federal officers, sort of aggressively stormed into the crowd, pushing people over, striking them, and moved them out of the way so that Trump could walk across Lafayette Square, visit a historic church that's there just across the street from the square. He didn't actually do any visiting of the church. He stood out beside it and held up a Bible and then turned around and walked back. On the whole, that response has raised real alarms that there's lines being crossed well into authoritarianism territory. These are the characteristics of a strongman authoritarian response.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Those tendencies are something that many commentators have accused Trump of all along, in how he blurs the lines of executive authority, how he tends to see the law enforcement arms of the state as serving only his political purposes. And of course, his kind of black is white rhetoric on certain things, even things as trivial as the size of the crowds at his inauguration and all of that. So, I mean, he's been accused of this for a long time. But when we're talking about actually deploying the military, and a battalion of Army soldiers, active duty military, have actually been transitioned into the National Capital Region, into Washington, D.C. here to aid in the response. People think this is it. This is crossed the line. And I was hearing that from many people out in the street yesterday. I was also hearing that from Jason Stanley, who's a Yale philosopher, who's an expert on fascism, who wrote a book called How Fascism Works. I wrote about this in The Star. And he said, yeah, this is textbook fascism, right? And so, as alarmist as that sounds, that's the response that Trump has deployed. But the interesting thing is that after that, the response has, at least in the very short term, Trump's response has seemed to inspire resolve among the general public. First of all, there's been an outcry among even people who typically wouldn't cry out. Pat Robertson, the televangelist and right-wing figure, scolded Trump on TV and said, this is not cool. This is the time to say, I hear your pain. I understand what you're going through, and to try and offer comfort. And former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the head of the military, wrote an essay in Atlantic saying that he was humiliated to see how the military was deployed, and he thinks this is improper. But also, you know, in a more street level, tangible effect, the peaceful protest yesterday as the Washington curfew, and when I say yesterday, I mean Tuesday, the day after Trump's statement, was larger than the ones that had been in the days before. And that followed in the Washington suburbs, in other neighborhoods of Washington. There were many daytime protests. But as in the evening, as the curfew was coming into play, the crowd around Lafayette Square, 24 hours after that scene played out that I just described before, was much larger than the crowds had been the nights before. People I was talking to there, some of them told me this was their first time out, and that it was the president's response and their fears that he was behaving like a king and that we're progressing towards some sort of police state that brought them out. As the 7 p.m. curfew came into effect, it was interesting to see. It was a large crowd, I would say, cross-section of Washington society. I mean, there were, as usual, many black people there, but also many white people, Asians, South Asians. It was represented sort of the racial diversity of Washington, which is an international city, but also like lots of senior citizens, people pushing strollers or with kids up on their shoulders, lots of teenagers. And the most aggressive thing about those protesters there was foul language in some of the chants. And there was a moment right as the curfew was coming into effect, and a PA system that somebody had brought that had been playing, NWA and Public Enemy songs. So it was like all the 80s bangers, was playing the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech. And then right as 7 p.m. came into effect, the entire crowd kind of take a knee, and there was silence. And then they stayed there, at that size for another hour or two, defying the curfew, and the police on the other side of a newly erected large fence kind of just held their ground and stayed back. But it was something to see that the president's response had provoked a response that was, as I say, very peaceful that night, but also larger than the crowds that had been out before. And not coincidentally, or maybe coincidentally, it was also primary election day in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. And there were long lines stretching around the block, social distancing lines, people standing 6 feet apart, like you'd see at a Home Depot or something, but around the block and around the corner at polling stations. And the first person I talked to in line at one of the polling stations in Georgetown said that, while he was waiting in line to vote, the primary thing on his mind was, the authoritarian reaction of the president, his sadness at what was taking place around the country, specifically because it was a symbol or something brought together by an exemplifying kind of racial injustice, but that also the president's response, it was not just disproportionate, it was improper in his point of view, and it was top of mind. And incidentally, the polls in those primary election sites where people were voting in a presidential nomination race that is already decided, right? Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee. They also had some city council primary races on the ballot and whatnot. But still, people were lined up at some stations until midnight or after midnight. Voters were also, those who were in the act of voting were also exempt from the curfew specifically. But, democracy was sort of trying to have its way in the midst of all of this at the same time.
That's interesting to note the response to his authoritarian reaction. Trump was universally criticized for his handling of the pandemic, which is obviously still going on, and now this unrest over race shows no sign of ending. These are two things that will likely perpetuate each other, but they're also two things that are just so big that he can't distract or obfuscate or blame his way out of. Would you agree with that?
I think I do to some extent. Certainly with the coronavirus, it was kind of widely reported, but it was also evident from his own sort of public statements and behavior that he was tired of this story. He's tired of it being, of this nationwide crisis, an international crisis, but something he can't control and can't sort of get on top of, being the story every day. For a while, he was very obviously trying to be the man in charge of coronavirus. He was holding those daily press briefings that were often very eccentric, often went on wild tangents off the top of Trump's head, but he was on TV every day for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, showing that he was in charge. But as that didn't turn the tide, he stopped having those briefings, and he was increasingly started talking, throwing out his Obamagate conspiracy theory, his baseless demands for a murder investigation in a debunked theory of a crime that didn't happen. An accidental death is what it's been fairly conclusively ruled in the case of a cable television host, continuing to sort of battle with China, trying to turn the page on the coronavirus. And it is a case here where you have a massive public health crisis, and what comes with that is massive economic crisis that the United States and Canada and the world, but in particular the United States, may be still in the early going of the economic consequences of this. And now a sort of national crisis of a different kind. And they're all, as you say, like so big, but also so complicated and so difficult to nail down. There's no easy solution. One of the questions I've been asking protesters in the street, what's the satisfactory resolution? How do you solve this? What do you want to happen as a result of this? And there are some specific things about police reform that many protesters will mention. There are specific things about the George Floyd case that they'll mention. But in a bigger sense, they're looking to move the country towards racial justice, towards policing justice. And even if a president, Joe Biden, who's running for president, said yesterday in his speech, even if the president makes this a priority, it's not going to be accomplished in one term. It's going to be a years-long process, not a days-long process. And so I don't think that, from what I've seen, authorities either in the Trump administration or in states around the United States are moving towards a resolution on this. But even if they were trying to move towards a resolution on this, it's not a quick fix. The anger and the hurt that's being expressed out there is not going to go away quickly. And that also appears to be the case with coronavirus. That's also almost certainly the case with the economy, where you have the highest unemployment rate across the United States since the Great Depression, and many industries so deep that major players are going into bankruptcy, and minor players, especially things like restaurants and frontline retail, may not recover from this. And so there's a lot going on that affects real people's daily lives, and they're not the sort of problems that you can easily issue an executive order or a statement to fix, even if you wanted to. And they're also not the sort of problems that, as you say, it's easy to distract from. You can get headlines or stir up Twitter by saying something outrageous to try and turn the page, which is a tactic that Trump is good at. And yet, when the furor over whatever that statement was dies down, these problems and the public mood that they inspire are still there.
It's a fascinating time, and I'm sure we and the world will be watching. Ed, I really want to thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Ed Keenan is the Washington Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.